Talofa, hello, and welcome back to Two Sides to Every History, the podcast where we recount historically significant instances of overcoming foreign domination from across the globe. I'm your host, Molly, and today we will be turning our gaze to the now independent Polynesian island of Samoa. Our introductory first-hand account was just a small segment of one of the many songs of the people of the Mau movement, the colonial resistance that is the primary focus of today's episode. As always with our podcast, we will dive into each historical context by examining two contrasting perspectives from primary sources. Today's episode, those perspectives are of Colonel Stephen Allen and Tuimalea Li'ifano. So, let's begin our journey through Samoa's Mau movement. Both Stephen and Tuimalea Li'ifano's perspectives are derived from opposing sides of the same political climate, captured during the height of the Mau movement in 1930 to 1931. Let's then begin considering their stances by unweaving the colonial tapestry that attempted to engulf Samoa prior to this period. Until 1900, Samoa was self-governing. Of course, colonial influence is much more complex than formal titles. Germany, however, was the first nation to extend its colonial arms into a chokehold, taking formal control of Samoa at the turn of the 19th century. This reign would last 14 years, until New Zealand invaded and forcibly assumed authority over German Samoa in the midst of World War I. So, in the wake of bringing an influenza that killed 22% of the population, undermining traditional land tenure, hindering indigenous trade agreements, and undermining Samoan culture, the resurgence of Samoan resistance against foreign domination began in 1926. This resistance movement was the Mau, a courageous and non-violent freedom movement attempting to promote decolonization and independence of Samoa. The New Zealand administration met this movement with force. The tension between the two groups then culminated in the brutal murdering of 12 peacefully protesting Mau by New Zealand police on December 29, 1929, in what is now known as Black Saturday. It is this political backdrop that frames the perspectives of our two primary sources, one from the New Zealand administration, the other a voice for Samoan independence. Thus begins the story of Allen and Tuimalea Li'ifano. Our first historical perspective profile is of Colonel Stephen Allen. Allen arrived to assume the role of New Zealand administrator on the 5th of May, 1928. His position authorised him executive power over Samoa, answering only to the New Zealand Minister of External Affairs for reporting or lawmaking. Allen's positionality as a man of military experience and cultural inexperience would then significantly influence his approach to the role. Disturbing attitude towards the indigenous people of Samoa and subsequent cruel, unempathetic actions are unfortunately characteristic of most imperialists. Men like Allen thoroughly believed in imperial doctrine that rationalized exploiting or taking hostage of other countries, based on the ideals of social Darwinism and other racist mantras. For him, destroying the Mau was not an inhumane act because his colonial lens prevented him from perceiving them as human. His position is a broader reflection of the dominant colonial thinking of European settlers and imperial powers of the era. As we continue into this episode analysing his briefing papers for the next administrator, it is imperative to consider how this background would have biased his positionality. This in no way vindicates his nauseating beliefs, simply contextualize them. Having a contrasting authorship such as Tui's is then even more important. Unlike Allen's imperialist influences, Tuimalea Li'ifano's motivations for speaking in support of the Mao would have been deeply connected to his Samoan roots. At the time of the source, Tui was 84. That means that he was born into an independent Samoa, spent his first 54 years in an independent Samoa, only for his home to be occupied for the latter 30. Unlike those born after 1900, Tui had distinct memories of a Samoa free from total foreign domination. It would have only increased his adversity to New Zealand authority, particularly of Allen. The effects of Black Saturday and culminating acts against his people would have also influenced his authorship, because contrasting to Allen, New Zealand interference was personal, not just political. Each act against the Mao would have had an intimate impact on his life, as those targeted were not just people, but his people. Now, before confronting the content of our sources, I want to consider the matter of their genre. Tui and Allen's perspectives were indeed intended to be received by different audiences, namely in that Allen's briefing papers weren't meant for an audience at all. His words would have been written in confidence, meant only for the eyes of his successor. In these papers, he expressed his perception of the Mao freely, in a manner that reflected his deep imperialist biases. However, I think it's unrealistic to assume that much of the position he detailed wasn't also voiced to the public arena. His aggressive strategies during his administration would have communicated his feeling towards the Mao enough. The nature of his private briefing papers merely detailed this to a greater extent. The genre of Tui's source is then a direct contrast to this, spoken at a public meeting with Allen, the New Zealand administration, and the Mao. The public nature of this meeting would have required greater formality than if he was speaking among the Mao, but he is still bravely open about his opposition to the New Zealand administration and their cruelty. So I guess it's time to answer the question you've probably all been thinking. What of their cruelty? What is the content of Allen's paper that reveals his imperialist biases? And how does Tui's speech show the tangible, devastating impacts of colonization? The answers will be divulged after this short break. The content of Allen's briefing papers can be defined by two major interwoven themes: social Darwinism and colonialism. The majority of his writing to the next administrator likens the people of Samoa to children, or worse, apes. To quote him on the progress he believed that colonial structures had made on the indigenous population, "It is the quickness of that great imitator, the ape, that is being developed, and not that of the human species," and that a Samoan in his early 20s was the mental equivalent of a European boy of 12. This attitude is a function of the racist, imperial narrative of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was a belief system that European and Western culture, society, and person was innately more superior and significantly more evolved than any other. It is this false philosophy that translated to people in positions of power, like Allen, imposing the ape narrative on indigenous people. Because Allen was unfamiliar with Samoan culture, instead of viewing them as different, he viewed them as worse. This is underlined through his colonial view that Samoan structures should either be wiped out or converted to European equivalents as the so-called superior mode of living. Allen directs the next administrator to impose a colonial legacy when writing ill of Samoan forms and ceremonies, especially Samoan speeches, criticizing chiefs of arrogance and conceit. This highlights his colonial biases as he demeans Samoan people as though they were children a colonist might be able to raise. Our podcast is called Two Sides to Every History for a reason. In Tui's speech to the New Zealand administration, his words also reflect colonialism, but from the colonised perspective instead of the coloniser. Furthermore, his words reveal the discrepancies in the imperial narrative of social Darwinism, as his speech proves that, if anything, the New Zealand administration was the barbaric, conceited group. Tui displays this as the case when describing the lies and deceit of the administration, saying that you should have righteousness and truthfulness. Act as Christ taught us. Be truthful. Why are you telling lies? This exposes the contradiction in the colonial narrative that invasion was a means of transferring supposed superior European values, when it is clear that the administration's true values were to be cunning and manipulative. Using Christ as a measure of control simultaneously highlights the manipulation of religion by colonial powers as an attempt to force Indigenous people to their structures and cultural lens. Tui's speech further uncovers the brutal nature of the New Zealand administration, describing that thousands, many thousands, of Samoans have been buried in the earth. This shows the reverse to what you would expect if social Darwinism was true, as the killing of Indigenous people due to disagreement could hardly be described as a more civilized culture. Now, whilst it might be easy to blow off Allen's source as gross or disgusting, it is an extremely important piece of history that, unfortunately, accurately represents the dominant colonial attitude during that time. It is important because his words are a preservation of the treatment that New Zealand gave Samoa during their colonial interference, evidence that nobody can deny or erase. Allen's briefing papers are significant because it only further stresses that Samoa later gaining independence was such an incredible feat, that the Samoan population were so powerful in their fight and not the child that Allen ignorantly believed them to be. Tui's source then highlights this fight, underlines New Zealand's deep, rotten colonial roots. His source acts as a representation of colonial resistance that was significant in the journey to Samoa gaining independence. It enforces the real nature of Samoan people, instead of whatever colonial narrative a racist imperial administrator spewed. His source is a cornerstone for Indigenous resistance, reflecting a significant part of Samoan history. So, there's your introduction to the Mau movement and Samoa's road to independence. Check out our source list on our website for further reading. Thanks for joining us. This has been another episode of Two Sides to Every History.